Welcome to Autism ADHD TV. It is the place to be for parents and professionals. I'm your host, Holly Blanc Moses, the mom psychologist who gets it. We dive into all kinds of important information like behavior, social skills, and learning. All right, let's get started. Welcome back to the Autism ADHD podcast and Autism ADHD TV.
Thank you, Holly, so much for having me back for part 2 of this really important and complex discussion.
I am thrilled that you are back. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or haven't caught part 1 last week, make sure you go back and catch that one. Jared and I talked about the pros, cons, and consequences of screen time overuse. You're going to need to listen to that one. It's very, very important. It's going to make sense with what we're discussing today, which is the solutions and strategies for screen time overuse. So, Jared, I'm going to introduce you real quick.
Absolutely.
Dr. Jared Brown is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jared has completed 4 separate master's degree programs and holds graduate certificates in autism, other health disabilities, and traumatic brain injuries. He's also published several articles and book chapters. So, are you ready to get into all the goodness? Because we know this is such an important topic, but before that, let's just recap a little bit on the pros, cons, and consequences of screen time overuse.
Absolutely. So if you're tuning in, obviously we're gearing this toward kind of the autism community. But if you have a child with any disability or a child without a disability, I think there's going to be a lot of information in here that's got to be applicable to you as a parent. So I don't ever want to put down the use of the internet because there's a lot of, there's a lot of benefits we talked about in part 1. I think it is imperative to learn how to use the internet in a safe and really kind of just pro-social manner. So we really need to make sure we're modeling those kind of good behaviors to children and those around us, and what is safe and what is unsafe uses of the internet and screen time. But the benefits are really many and varied for the internet. It can help us have access to information. It can really help us learn how to solve problems and make better decisions and paying bills online and going to school in this era of COVID-19. For a lot of families, obviously it added a lot of stressors, but it also helped families get connected to other resources, support groups. I've consulted on some cases during this era of COVID-19, and there were some clients that were able to get connected to different types of physical activity groups where they maybe did yoga online or some sort of exercise group. So it's not all bad. We're going to talk about some of the good things of this as well. For parents, working from home was a great thing for some. Obviously, it added a lot of stress for others. Self-improvement. I use the internet all the time to learn and grow and take certifications and things like that. For people that are in certain fields, again, the benefits are really many and varied. But today we're going to kind of talk about some of the negatives. When we think of screen time overuse or internet use, we also have to be aware that there is an addictive component to some of these things we're talking about today. And the research is pretty clear on this, that screen time overuse and misuse over a long period of time can almost look like an addictive type of disorder. Couple things to think about when we just talk about any type of addiction. Is that person starting to really get preoccupied with going online or being on the screen, where they're starting to neglect their day-to-day responsibilities? Maybe they're neglecting their homework. Maybe it's a teenager and an adult on the spectrum, and they're starting to neglect their work and not going to work. Maybe they're neglecting their hygiene. Maybe they're forgetting to take their medications as prescribed. Maybe they're starting to really live a sedentary lifestyle and they're not getting up and moving around and getting good exercise. All of those things are not good, and you want to be on the lookout for. What about tolerance too? When we think of an addictive tendency, is that individual starting to go on the screen more and more all the time, where it started out for a few hours a day, and then a few weeks later, now it's 4 hours, now it's 10 hours, now it's 16 hours. There's been cases I've consulted on where the individual's literally on there 16 hours plus a day. When that happens, obviously that can lead to significant stress for that family. The person probably is not sleeping well. Most likely they're not eating well and just getting proper movement. I think it's also important to consider when we look at this through an addictive lens, when you're asking that child or teenager or adult to get off the screen, what is that transition time like? Are they pretty cooperative? In a lot of cases, at least the cases I've consulted on, transitioning from going off the screen to kind of going back to day-to-day life can lead to a lot of explosive anger in some cases, irritability, rumination, and put added stress on that family system. So those are a few addictive components we want to be aware of. Now, the benefits, again, I mentioned are many and varied, but unfortunately, there's a lot of negative aspects to this as well. Social isolation goes up in a lot of cases. There's increases in depression, anxiety. It can have a real negative impact on self-esteem. It can really have an impact on their academic abilities. What happens if the person is highly gullible or naive? Does that person have a tendency to be taken advantage of in that online community where maybe they're giving away money to strangers? Maybe it's reached a point where now they're sharing inappropriate images with people they don't know, and it's resulted in criminal justice involvement. In some cases, some of the cases I've consulted on, it's clearly had a negative impact on their decision-making and problem solving. And it's really exacerbated some of those already existing autism-like behaviors. So the research is, again, pretty clear on this too. Excessive screen time use for someone on the autism spectrum can exacerbate some of those social communication skills, those obsessional kind of fixated interests as well. So those are just a few of the things we want to keep in mind with the pros and the cons, Holly.
I think that is really important. And we talked in detail in part one. So again, I know we said this before, but make sure you go back and listen or watch part one. We talked about all of these topics in great detail. And so when you're talking about addiction, I have had patients that have spanned all of those examples that you had given. And it's quite common for kids with autism and or ADHD to experience these types of feelings, and even neurotypical people as well. So the strategies that we're going to talk about today, like you mentioned earlier, are not just for differently wired kids. They're also they can be helpful for neurotypical kids. In a household where you have both differently wired child and a neurotypical child, it's hard sometimes to have different rules for each child. It makes a family struggle. So some strategies, again, can be used across children. So that's a good thing.
Absolutely a great thing. And Holly, maybe you have some professionals tuning in as well. I just think being aware of some of the screening domains, the risk factors, the warning signs, because the more we can really highlight those, then you can implement supports, strategies, and solutions that can really help that individual thrive. But maybe there's something going on, again, as we mentioned in part one, within that family system too. What is screen time behavior like within that entire family system? I think it's very important to really understand modeling behavior. There's something called like mutual co-regulation or monitoring, or just being aware of like the term external brains, where what is going on with that caregiver, the support system? Are they modeling those behaviors to that individual? And through that screen time lens, I really think if parents or caregivers really use an attachment-based mindset or even a trauma-informed kind of lens, they're typically going to be more attuned and more attentive. They're going to have warm, caring, compassionate responses. Instilling safety and trust within that family system is obviously important for every family. Paying really close attention to maybe some of these subtle kind of behaviors, these red flag indicators, because early intervention and prevention are obviously key. The earlier you can identify these things, better outcomes can happen. Consistency is important. Predictability. If there's multiple people in the house, making sure everyone's saying the same thing. It's consistent, making sure one caregiver is not saying, okay, you have to be off by 7 o'clock tonight. The other caregiver is saying 7:30. That can be confusing. Reduce confusion as much as possible. Consistency, predictability, very helpful. Maybe it's providing just concrete supports, and the person has deficits with transitions. There's a lot of literature on choice-making deficits, which is a facet of decision-making. Really supporting choices as well in a really pro-social manner is very, very helpful. I'm a big fan of psychiatric rehabilitative approaches too. Those are approaches that are going to be like rooted in like coaching, modeling, teaching, role playing. You teach the skill at home, maybe the child or adult really grasps that. But what happens then on the way to school or work or on the bus or in different environments, making sure you're teaching these skills consistently throughout all of these environments, because it can get confusing if there's rules different at school versus home. Again, this is easier said than done. But again, coaching, modeling, teaching, making things visual, concrete. Maybe it's using video modeling approaches, social stories. Thought bubble training is something out of the theory of mind literature. I would definitely recommend understanding theory of mind, which is a core deficit in this population. Helping the individual learn how to put on the brakes and pause. That's a component of self-regulation and inhibition and just self-control. If you can teach the individual learning how to wait, that is a great skill. Maybe it's teaching self-soothing skills. The person really has those kind of just high anxiety, high irritability, helping them learn how to monitor that and name those emotions. It is also quite common for this population to be dealing with alexithymia, which is an emotional awareness deficit where they have a hard time kind of processing emotions, understanding the emotions of other people. A lot of times if someone had a true alexithymia, they might have a hard time saying, I'm angry, I'm mad, I don't want to get off the internet right now. And it comes out sideways through anger, irritability, fatigue, headaches, back pain. It comes out as somatic complaints in some cases. Promote critical thinking as well. Any of those things I think can be very, very helpful through kind of a mutual co-regulation and modeling lens. And I'll talk a lot more about some other strategies, but that's just a few things to think about for co-regulation, Holly.
So Jared, you touched on, I was trying to count in my head. You touched on so many beautiful things. So I'm going to get into a few of them. You mentioned being consistent. This is so hard, especially when, because I'm going to keep it real. I'm going to put my parent hat on for a second. When you are so exhausted, it's the end of the day, and a child really, really wants that screen time. And sometimes it can be a break for parents. I mean, where it is not easy. And so there's a lot of things in, and also if you have a partner in the house, another parent, then again, that person has to be on the same page, because what if they're extra exhausted and they want to go ahead and give that screen time just to have 15 minutes? So be kind to yourself if you feel like you're in a place where you can become flexible, and that probably is starting out very consistently and then working into some flexibility, that's okay. But like you said, it is so important to be on the same page. And I think that's where visuals can be helpful for not only children, but also parents. It's that, oh yes, we agreed on that. That's what's on the refrigerator. We're, reminding ourselves of what the rules are, and then supporting each other in that. You also mentioned modeling. I talked about this in part one. I was telling my youngest son, it's time to get off, when I was working on the computer. And instead of him, the way he's wired, he just thinks that's not fair. Not mommy has to work to shelter and feed us. So that makes sense. He's not there yet. So that's not fair. You're on and I can't be. So then we had to work through that. So there's a lot of things that we can do, which is beautiful, because sometimes it feels like there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
I like how you brought up the trauma lens, and that's very much like that. The word trauma is a big word.
Yes.
I think when we see a child melting down and we're exhausted, maybe we're irritable as parents, and we just get angry, which is complete. I've been there. I understand how that feels. In the moment, it feels big for us. I want us to also imagine what it feels like for them. It's so much bigger for them. They are reacting the way they are feeling. So we have to kind of match that up and understand this can be traumatic. Getting off a device can be traumatic for them. So instead of, you're not listening, you're making bad choices, you're driving me crazy, all of those things that might pop up in our heads and even out of our mouths, I think it does show us another way to process what's happening in a more supportive way, in a way to understand they are really struggling. And again, behavior is communication. They're not trying to give us a hard time. They are having a hard time. And I think if we look at it that way, we can regulate ourselves better. We can understand our children better, and we are in a great place to support them.
Got to do it in community. And again, find a network. And you're going to realize soon enough, you're not alone. There's so many other people probably experiencing similar stressors, thoughts, worries. And when you realize you're not alone, that isolation can become freeing when you connect with other people. And then you can really start getting new ideas, perspectives, what's working, what's not. I think seeking out as much knowledge about these topics as possible, and knowing we don't always have the answer. What works one day may not work the next. But again, what I found, Holly, is again, consistency, predictability. If you use those attachment-based and trauma-informed approaches, I think that's a lot of good outcomes can happen. Can I share one case study with you just to kind of bring this together too? What I've seen consistently with kind of the cases I'm consulting on, we know that sleep problems are very high among people with autism in general. When then you start introducing some addictive tendencies to the screen, at least the cases I've consulted on, 100% of the time they're dealing with sleep issues. And if one family member is not sleeping well, particularly that child or teenager, a lot of times the parents aren't sleeping well. So really focusing on managing your fatigue and sleep health is going to be so important to building your resilience, to be able to have more of a buffer so you don't get as reactive or irritable and you can really stick with it. Case I consulted on last year, this was a person on the autism spectrum. He lived with both parents who are older, and he had a true internet and cell phone addiction. So we got to take into account not just the internet or screen, but what about cell phones? This really impacted his mood, his energy, his motivation, and it really trickled down into just poor sleep. He would sleep till 12 every day, so it was really almost impossible for him to hold a job and maintain a job, and it really contributed to planning, organization, and time management deficits. And he also, when he was starting to be on the screen a lot, he developed a sugar addiction. So needless to say, now you have a screen time addiction, sugar addiction, you're not sleeping well. You can about imagine how good that is for his body. So he started to put on weight. He started to develop more like neck and body pain. So it's contributing to kind of like low-grade inflammation in the body. And that really trickled down to impact his mood and how he communicated with his family. And it just put so much stress on that entire family system. Once the family started learning about all these things and he started learning and they started implementing some checks and balances and fences and boundaries, these things started to gradually turn around and move in a better direction. So I want to encourage caregivers and parents and professionals too, that when you're implementing these strategies, you might not see improvements overnight. It could be a process. It could take time. So being patient, I think I always look through a lens of being kind, calm, patient, and curious. When things aren't working, don't jump to conclusions. Try to stay curious. by using those approaches, I found it does create more change. And if you're coming off more empathetic, more attuned, and you're doing a lot of listening and you hear those stories and patterns, then you can start implementing some strategies that might be more appropriate to that individual's unique circumstance. After learning why he was thrusting himself so much into the internet, we learned that he was dealing with a lot of workplace related bullying. So he came home from work. He couldn't articulate to his parents what was going on. Either he was ashamed or shy or embarrassed, or he had a really hard time again connecting his feelings to his emotions and thoughts. Once we figured that out, strategies were implemented and things really did turn around. So that's one case of many. I have a couple more cases I can share today too, Holly, if that's helpful.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up, again, it's not just one thing. It's never just, I want to play longer and I'm mad because you won't let me. So again, when you were talking about that trauma response, I have never, and like you have consulted on many cases, and I've worked with the hundreds of kids. I have never once seen it be one thing.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, sleep, there was bullying occurring in the workplace that could easily translate to school. Sleep has everything to do with getting up and being in school and being engaged and listening and following instructions. And when your body is not cooperating, that can be really difficult. Like you said, that it has an impact on diet, which can sometimes be already restrictive in these populations. So it really brings about a lot of difficult struggles. And you were talking earlier about parents and children, their relationship. When you're telling your child it's time to get off and they're screaming and they're cursing and they're kicking and they may even become aggressive towards you, that feels really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then you may become really angry at your child and then swing in the whole other direction where you're just cut off. Right? No more
Thinking, just really learning how to regulate, because once you get dysregulated, it's just going to add fuel to the fire and it's not good. And easier said than done, obviously, but just another reason why caregivers learn those self-regulation, self-soothing strategies as much as possible. And if you become dysregulated, that might not be the best time to try to implement a strategy too. Take 20 minutes, go for a walk. Yeah.
Right. So perhaps when you have locked up all the electronics because your child spent money on there without your permission, it wasn't all locked up for gaming, and they break into the box, which this has happened so many times.
Absolutely.
So you can see when you mention addictive behavior, you were putting that need kind of in front of your relationship with your parents, and really anything else, right? Because that's all you can see in that moment.
Absolutely. This makes me really think we have to also look through kind of a lens of impulse control problems, impulsivity, self-regulation, self-control. And such an important topic. I have lots of trainings on self-control. But can I share another case that I just thought of? That this was an adult client on the autism spectrum. He lived in a group home. He had profound impulse control problems. He had issues with limit setting around food, caffeine intake. I mean, he would drink tons and tons and tons of coffee through the day, lots of soda, TV addiction, internet. He unfortunately had a pornography addiction too that led to a whole host of issues. So that's another area to definitely explore at some point in the future. But he did have a lot of sleep problems, daytime fatigue. He looked like he had ADHD. It's tough to know if he had true ADHD because he was chronically sleep deprived. So he was moving around and fidgeting and had a hard time sitting still and dealing with all these issues. He had a reduced self-awareness. So another tip, teach self-awareness strategies, very important. It really got in the way of his day-to-day motivation. And in some cases, when he was so sleep deprived and just dealing with all these issues, it contributed to high levels of rumination and paranoia. So those were all the challenges this person was dealing with. A lot of reasons for this I won't get into. but lots of family stuff, lots of past traumas, lots of things like that. He shared with me the coping strategies he learned along the way that helped him he didn't necessarily cure these things, but he got it under control and really helped him manage. He practiced healthy living skills. So he was consistent with going and exercising, walking. He read daily devotionals. That was very helpful to really focus on the positives. And he really got into gratitude journaling. That's a whole nother area to think about, or reflective journaling. Depending on the person and their functioning capability, that may be very appropriate, or in other cases, it might not be. He also really learned how to practice positive self-talk. He volunteered, he got a volunteer position, so he started to get outside of himself and give back to other people. He also found martial arts really helpful. Now, I'm not saying go out and get your child into martial arts. That's an individual decision in your family. But for this one person, he found joining martial arts, not to learn how to hurt people, but just learning breathing and just different strategies, was very helpful for this individual. And he also found drawing to be quite helpful. Those are a few strategies that this particular person used that seemed to help him really bring these problems down.
I think what you mentioned before, going from impulsivity, which most of the kids that I serve struggle with, it's really big. And again, what reaction are you going to have when a parent says, I'm going to take away everything you love?
The research shows that
Horrible.
if don't use technology as a punishment, the research kind of points to that, because that gets tricky. So something to think about there, I think, definitely. Do you want me to go into a few more strategies when talking about that? Would that be helpful through that lens?
Yeah, I think that would be good. One thing I did want to add as well is when I said horrible, I mean, for that child, like, it is such a terrible feeling. And that's why they're reacting the way they are, because it is kind of like cutting someone's lifeline. Right. So we're talking about all the things that are difficult with overuse for screen time and how that can negatively impact a person's life. But we also have to think about what that baseline is. So if they're online, phone, whatever that looks like, a total of 5 hours a day, 4 hours, 2 hours, whatever that is, completely changing from that amount of time quickly can really be damaging to that child and also to the parent-child relationship. So we want to look at how long they're spending, what is their baseline, what's happening right now, take that average before you start cutting back.
Would you say, Holly, like kind of almost a harm reduction model where you just gradually taper off, then cutting cold turkey, basically?
Yes, in my opinion, now every child is different, certainly, but because it is traumatic and because we really need to build up the other skills, such as communicating what's happening for that person, giving them those coping strategies, because a lot of times, and we talked about this in part 1, screen time is not only, yes, enjoyable, it gives you the stimulation in your brain, I mean, all of those things. It's also used as avoidance and a coping strategy, correct? So if my day is hard, nobody gets me, I'm masking all day, it's exhausting. People maybe are rude to me at school, my teachers don't understand me. What we don't want to do is rip away that coping strategy. And then what do we leave that child with? Then we're talking about depression and anxiety and all those things on the other end. So looking at, again, that baseline and gradually taking that down as we are teaching those strategies and reinforcing those strategies is really, in my opinion, the best way to go.
Perfect segue into what you said. Anything you can do to help enhance that person's skills, highlighting their attributes, understanding their hobbies, their skills, their interests, and really looking at it through a strengths-based lens, I think can be very helpful. The research is pretty clear on this too, in the cases I've consulted on as well. If the person is dealing with co-occurring mental health challenges or even physical health challenges, address those comorbidities. Maybe it's speech language pathology. Maybe it's working with a sleep specialist. Maybe it's working with an art-based interventionist. Maybe it's animal-assisted therapy, equine therapy. There's so many different interventions out there for people on the spectrum, depending on their needs and strengths. So focusing on those comorbidities. So if they're dealing with depression, help them with depression. If it's anxiety, help with anxiety. Anything you can do to help enhance their knowledge about the use of the screen, the risk, the benefits, the impact it can have on themselves and others, either positively or negatively, and teaching those skills in a manner that really aligns with their functioning capabilities. So just because someone on the spectrum may be 18 years old chronologically again, maybe they function as a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old. So whatever intervention you're teaching, change the vocabulary, change the approach, change the expectation to match their social, emotional, and developmental age. I think it's also important, as much as possible, regardless of if they're having a problem with the internet or screen, promoting pro-social skills. Maybe it is joining a support group and they're learning from peer interaction. Maybe it's looking at some of the literature on Lego-based interventions. That's a whole nother area to consider. Maybe it's a one-on-one skills worker in the home, or it is joining an actual group. Learning problem-solving skills. There's actually problem-solving therapy out there. You can Google that online. There's a whole training program just on that. So teaching problem-solving skills. If the person is dealing with some emotional regulation or self-control issues, implementing some support strategies, different things to help them slow down, pause, reflect, put on the brakes. Lots of research points to the fact that exercise is so helpful with all of these things. Deep breathing, mindfulness, yoga, even looking at some of the literature on group drumming. That's a fascinating area. There's actually some literature published on autism and group drumming exercises where you get into a group and you're drumming. There's something related to like gardening. So therapeutic gardening is a whole line of literature. Maybe someone likes getting outside. Anything you can do to enhance their green space exposure is a great thing. There's a lot of research on green space exposure. It's basically a fancy way of saying you're getting outside and getting in wilderness, being just outside, fresh air. That can be very helpful. There's something called cognitive restructuring. So if they have some just negative ruminating thoughts about themselves or others, helping them reframe that as well. What's their overall self-concept like? What do they believe in themselves? Are they dealing with lower levels of like self-esteem? Maybe it's lower levels of self-efficacy. Those are very important target areas as well.
And Jared, I want to make a comment about what you just said. I think that's so important. Once we get to the point where I'm helping a patient communicate what's happening for them, what I'm hearing is, I'm bad. I'm only cool online. I'm only good at this. Or people like me when I'm gaming with them. It is really easy to see how those, social differences and difficulty with peers and relating to them and knowing what to say and when, and initiating conversation, how being online and gaming can feel like the only way.
Absolutely. I hear that a lot. And correct me if I'm wrong, Holly, but what you're saying really goes to the heart of like pragmatic kind of language, pragmatic social skills. And how do you start a conversation? How do you end a conversation? How do you talk to a stranger versus someone you know? How do you talk to someone who's a child different than an adult, a family member versus a stranger? So really focusing on pragmatic language as well. And that's a component of speech language pathology, but also social skill groups and learning cooperation and greeting people and introductions. All of those things I think can be very, very helpful. Anything you can do to implement healthy living practices within that entire family system is going to be a good thing. Eating healthy, getting good sleep, taking care of your digestive health. There's a huge connection between what goes on in the gut and what goes on in the brain. Interestingly, looking at some of the research too on taking care of your dental health, there's a lot of literature that looks at how dental health impacts emotional and behavioral health. Learning how to get your stress down. Stress is going to be normal, but when it reaches that point of like chronic, long-term kind of toxic stress, that's when it can have a real negative wear and tear in the body, which is called allostatic load. And if you've ever studied like the adverse childhood experiences research, you'd understand that topic. But get toxic stress down and just know that, again, you're not alone, and form a positive, healthy support group and find positive outlets that you can reach out to as well, and just implement those strategies within that entire family system can really lead to, I think, better outcomes for all involved.
And I like that you were bringing up finding those supports, because this is not easy. This is not easy. I think everyone listening is like, amen. That is so true. And you may be feeling like, I've tried that, or that won't work for my child. What is really exciting is when you're looking for that support, again, social support, other parents, but also the right provider. A match for your child who has experience in gaming and how to manage screens, how to help them in these different ways. And every child is different. So what we're talking about are some strategies and some variables to consider, but maybe one child is approached in a certain way. For instance, maybe you're throwing the tennis ball for 5 minutes before you're getting on the screen. You can also enhance other interests and activities by pairing them close in time with screen time that we already know is important to that child. So there is always a way. So I want to give those of you who are ripping your hair out listening because you're so stressed, you love your child so much, you just want to help them. There is always a way. Always.
Can I leave your audience with a handful of more tips and kind of just pull it all together? Because we covered a lot of stuff. So this is obviously, we're scratching the surface with some of these things. These are big topics we could spend all day on. But anything you can do to continue your education in this, you find tons of resources online. Reach out to me, send me an email. I can send you links to different things. I think it's important to also learn about like parental controls and different privacy settings and just different apps and tools that are out there to help put some boundaries and fences on your child or adult, if appropriate. Again, you have to decide as a family. Teaching and modeling what's acceptable and unacceptable kind of screen time behaviors. So again, parents co-modeling all of those things. Within that family unit too, I think it's important to really establish areas in your house, just in my opinion, that are kind of almost technology-free zones where you kind of keep it contained to a certain area. Research is very clear. Keep technology out of the kid's bedroom as much as possible, especially in the evening hours. I think it's also important not to scare anyone, but to also teach your children and adults the dangers of being online, what to look out for, modeling these behaviors too, and really just talking about safety considerations. Monitor their behaviors, their habits while being online. Just don't give them free rein. Establish really clear technology use expectations. Again, consistency, structure, predictability, limit setting, promoting time management. Again, if you say to your child or adult, you have an hour to be on the computer, what does that truly mean? For some people, an hour could feel like 2 hours, or an hour could feel like 10 minutes. Really define time.
And Jared, I will say about time, and in a way you can think about it, it is truly time blindness. And that has a lot to do with executive functioning. And we see how that impacts them in different ways. If I was to say, go do this non-preferred, go take out the garbage and clean up the sticks in the front yard, that would feel like forever. I mean, literally forever to a child who has differences in time understanding. But if they're online or doing a preferred activity, it feels like it's never enough time. I was only on for a minute. and it actually was 30 minutes. So that gives you an idea to actually show time. I am a super fan of, and I'm just grabbing it really quick for those who are watching on Autism ADHD TV on YouTube, is the time timer, where they can see the red disappearing. At first, when you're using the time timer, I would recommend showing them how to wait. So for instance, say in 15 minutes, you can get online, set it for 15 minutes, or if it's 10 minutes, that way they can see the red. I don't recommend setting it for screen time use at first, especially if your child is really struggling getting off. That can kind of increase anxiety for some children. So another thing, we were talking about controls for my 17-year-old. He actually uses a Gab wireless phone. So he has a phone, but he can't send pictures, he can't receive pictures, and it has no browser. So he's unable to get on a browser because of safety. We also use Bark, which is a way that we can kind of look and see how our youngest is using his time on a browser, so that we have some systems in place that can actually help a little bit bring down the anxiety. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and not to nerd out too much, but for those who are really want to dig in, I am a fan of Dr. Greg Hanley's My Way strategy. And that's how you keep a child, and again, this is through a trauma lens as well, keep a child happy, relaxed, and engaged. And it then becomes the child will bring down their anxiety related to that screen time. It's really exciting research and work that he's doing as well. So, and again, backing it up, when we were talking about regulating as a parent, again, personally, not so easy, especially if I am tired, if I'm hungry, if I'm worked 12 hours, it can be exhausting. And then you have a dysregulated child on top of that, and then you're just becoming more and more dysregulated together. So it ends up being not only a child meltdown, but a parent meltdown as well. And as we know, that doesn't go anywhere. So if we step back and look, when we're working on our own regulation, because we talk about child regulation, we need to regulate them. Well, we also have to start with ourselves first, right? And if you become dysregulated, that's okay, because it happens and you're human. I was dysregulated just the other day with my own children, and I do this for a living. So you have to forgive yourself. There are ways to go towards these beautiful skills are going to need to have, like waiting and communicating what's happening for them. Again, don't be discouraged. This is a great episode to talk about what's possible.
Self-compassion, but kind of talk in a way too. Practicing self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and none of us are perfect. These are hard situations. Couple final things that just popped in my mind. I forgot to say earlier, multitasking. Avoid it at all costs. I am an expert multitasker, so I'm not one to say this, but if you can model to your child or adult how not to multitask, that's a good thing. The research is pretty clear. If that person starts multitasking and learning those behaviors early on, it can really divide attention and have an impact on learning attention memory. Limit screen time use in the evening as much as possible, because we're glued to this screen at night. It tells our brain to stay up longer, and it produces more cortisol, and you don't want more cortisol in the evening. You want more melatonin. And we know from the research that for some people on the autism spectrum, they may have some melatonin abnormalities in general. So be aware of that. Anything you can do too to have like almost a technology-free meal time. If you're having dinner together, get technology out of there as much as possible. Sit face to face, talk. It's a great way to just connect and process emotions through the day. Get outside in the green, fresh air when possible, promote active play behaviors as well, getting out with other people as much as possible, and explore other hobby skills and interests this person may be able to do besides being on the internet as well. So having some balance there. So those are a few other things I thought about, but is there anything else that would be helpful you'd want me to share with your audience today, Holly?
Actually, I did bring this up during part 1, but I am a fan of OutSchool, and that is online, but it's not it's not a situation where they're alone. So for instance, you go into outschool.com, there is a search bar, you type in your child's interest, and more than likely some clubs or some classes are going to come up that are related. And that will allow them to really experience other people, other kids that have similar interests, which actually reduces their anxiety around social interaction. So when you are thinking about electronics, it's not just play. It could be play in a way that's going to assist them in lowering their anxiety, lowering that risk around social interaction. I know a lot of children have been rejected over and over again. The idea of talking to other kids or interacting is just an invitation for more rejection to them. That's how they're feeling. So what would you do? You would avoid that. This might be a door open into a social situation that allows them to experience a better social interaction with less anxiety. So that's something to think about as well.
Fantastic resources. I will look at all those as well. I learned a lot from all those resources too. So thank you, Holly. If there's anything I can do to be helpful to your audience, you're welcome to share my email address with them as well, which is Jerrod, Jerrod, 01234 Brown, BROWN, at live.com.
Jerrod, that was so generous of you to offer that support. And again, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you come back on and we can talk about another topic.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, everyone.
Take care. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with someone. It may just be what they need to watch today. If you're a parent, I'd love if you came on over and joined our Facebook group, Autism ADHD Group for Parents. If you're a therapist or educator, come on over to our group, Autism ADHD Group for Therapists and Educators. You're going to find those links right down there in the notes. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and/or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.